Hello, and thank you for choosing this full-length, clean, historical Western romance by Kat Lynn. We are so happy to have you with us today. Before we begin, don't forget to tap the subscribe button and like and share with your friends. Your support allows us to continue sharing these sweet, heartwarming stories for free. Now, relax and get ready to travel back in time to the American frontier, where we join an adventure to find love and happily ever after. Enjoy. Copyright of Kat Lynn.
Mail Order Convoy by Kat Lynn. Prologue. Listen to me very carefully. Run. Run, Annie. I know you're scared of Geoffrey. I know you're clinging to the hope that there's another way to get out of this situation. But there isn't. Not yet, anyway. We've spoken endlessly about this, but we couldn't figure out a way out of the situation. Maybe we'll find a way to get rid of Geoffrey's hold over us. I hope we do. Will you sit around until then and let him do to you as he wishes? Will you let him control you? Please, sister, it pains me to know you're all by yourself, waiting till you find out his intention. I was aghast when I read your letter. Geoffrey really has gone mad. He's going too far. I'm scared to think of what his plans are. While I was reading your letter, the urge to come home gripped me. I wished I could run to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and rescue you out of his grasp. Every day, I wonder if I should have taken you with me. I suspected he'd turn his eyes on you next. I'm sorry, Annie, that you're in this situation because of me. Please, I beg of you, find a way to flee. That's the only thing you can do. Geoffrey wouldn't marry you off with pure wishes of your happiness. Flee, sister. Flee. Love, Minnie. Annie read the letter over and over again. It was wrinkled from being read too often. At least once a day, she brought the letter out of her box and read it. Her twin sister's words comforted her, giving her hope and courage that she could take her life into her hands. The words poured life into her as she read the letter. Maybe she could do it. Take control of her life, instead of waiting for whatever plans someone else had for her. A lightness came over her as she read and reread the words, and her eyes lit up with hope about what could be. Then she dropped the letter, and the courage faded away. Her new reality stared her in the face. She was in a room in the highest part of Geoffrey's house, hundreds of miles away from her other sisters. The walls of the room were sparkling white. Everything was white. There was not a hint of color in sight. It was all so very depressing. Annie flopped on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The events of the previous week flashed through her mind. The sisters had been in the parlor talking about Minnie's happy marriage when Geoffrey stormed in. They'd gone silent immediately. That was their new way of dealing with him. Silence. It hadn't taken them long to know how to act whenever he was around. They watched him rant and order them around, but they never said a word. They only stared at him silently. They did the same thing on that day. Annie should have known he'd take out his anger at losing Minnie on her. At first, he'd done nothing, just stayed in his study and held meetings with strange men. A few weeks passed, and Annie thought she'd escaped. When he entered the parlor with that determined look in his eye, she'd known. It was time. And he was coming for her next. A knock on the door drew her out of her thoughts. "Miss?" Maria opened the door and stuck her head through the small opening. Her eyes were large in her small oval face. She looked at Annie sprawled on the bed, and a hint of concern flitted in her gray eyes. She entered the room and shut the door gently behind her. "Are you ill?" Annie wanted to say yes. She was more than ill. There was an ache in her heart that was intent on never going away. She didn't know whether to cry or she didn't know what else to do. Sighing, she sat up. "I'm not ill." She glanced at her maid, who had served her dutifully since she'd arrived the hours 2 weeks ago. Her long blonde hair was tied in an austere bun, but that did nothing to conceal her age. She was very young, about Annie's age, or a year older. Annie couldn't say for certain. "What is it?" "You haven't left your room all day. I wanted to check if you were hungry, or if you needed anything." "No, I don't need anything." A lie. She needed many things, but none that the maid could offer. She needed clarity. She needed someone to talk to, someone to help her decide what to do. She needed Minnie. Her twin would know what to do. She always did. Although they looked alike, their personalities were a stark contrast. Minnie was bold and fearless. Annie was softer and gentler. Without Minnie's unwavering strength, Annie had nothing to hold on to. It was Minnie that had convinced her to go to their father's study in search of their dowry. They'd found it, and it had given the 7 sisters something to hold on to. It gave them hope. Annie's gaze landed on a box beside her bed. "Shall I help you unpack the box?" Maria said, following the direction of her gaze. She perked up immediately, eager to finally have something to do. Maria was always eager to serve. The maid didn't seem to want a moment's rest. Annie shook her head. No. Annie hadn't unpacked that box since she'd arrived at Geoffrey's house. She didn't want to. It contained all her valuables, some memorabilia of her mother, gifts from her sisters, some jewelry her dead father had given her, and her dowry, her father's last gift to her. "Are you certain?" Maria said, stepping further into the room. "I can." She was so fixated on Annie that she didn't notice the small vase on the floor. She tripped, falling on the floor with her arms outstretched. Annie jumped to her feet. She rushed to Maria's side. Gradually, she helped her up, murmuring words of comfort. Maria's cheeks were red. She stared at the broken vase and gasped. Her eyes filled with tears. "Oh, miss, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." She got to her knees and started picking up the broken pieces. Annie held her hands firmly. No, you'll hurt yourself." She dragged her up. "You can clean those later. It's my fault. I was playing with it and thinking of home. It looks just like the one my father had." A tear rolled down the maid's pale cheek. "I broke your vase. I'm so sorry." Annie smiled. "It's just a vase, Maria. If you'd hurt yourself, that would have been much worse." Maria gave her an indiscernible look. "Oh, thank you, miss." She started hurrying out of the room. At the door, she turned back to Annie. "Is there anything you need?" Annie read the desperation in her eyes. Maria wanted to find a way to compensate for the broken vase. Accepting the offer would make the maid feel better about the incident. Annie nodded. "A glass of juice will be fine." Maria nodded. "And cake?" Annie's face broke into a smile. "That sounds wonderful." She didn't really want to eat cake, nor did she care much for juice, but Maria wanted to do something for her, so she'd let her. Minutes later, Maria returned with a tray with juice and 2 slices of cake. She'd comported herself. Her eyes were dry, and she wasn't as fidgety. Her gaze dropped to the broken vase, and she grimaced. Annie thanked her and took a sip of the drink for good measure. Maria didn't leave immediately. She opened her mouth to speak, then clamped her lips shut. Her hesitation piqued Annie's curiosity. "What's the matter?" Annie said. I noticed you're not happy here." Maria stared at her feet as she spoke. "Mister brought you here by force, no?" She didn't speak like a native. Her English was broken and heavily accented. Annie wasn't sure where Maria was from. Several parts of New York contained immigrants from different countries. With the way she acted, Annie could judge from her inexperience that this was her first job as a maid. Annie placed the drink on the tray. She'd been wanting someone to talk to since she arrived, and she hadn't had anyone. Maria looked eager to listen. Her eyes were warm and compassionate. Annie released a long breath. "He did. I left my sisters behind." Maria's eyes turned sad. "That is sad. I left my sisters behind in Germany, too." At the horrified look on Annie's face, she quickly added, "But they are here now. We're together again." Annie wished, more than anything, to be together again with her sisters. Yet she was stuck here, with no inkling of whatever Geoffrey was planning for her. "I heard the master making plans for you to travel to London, to meet your groom." Annie stared at her in horror. Cold fear poured into her spine. Her mouth went slack. London? She'd known Geoffrey had something up his sleeve, but she'd been terrified to find out. A cloud of doom hung over Annie. A wave of fatigue swept through her, and she shut her eyes. She couldn't believe this. "Oh," a tear dropped from her eye. "Please don't cry." Maria sat beside her. Her expression was pained. "I know you're not happy here. You won't be happy there either since Master is forcing you to marry." Annie grasped her hand. At that moment, all she needed was comfort and a listening ear. "What will I do? I can't do anything. He's our guardian now. He can do with us as he wills." She thought of the content of Minnie's letter, and her heart sank. Minnie would be appalled to hear her speak with such defeat. But Annie had never been like her sister. She couldn't pretend to be bold. The minutes ticked by in silence. The maid sat with her, offering her comfort with her quiet presence. "There is a way." She spoke quietly, but with a strength that caught Annie's attention. My aunt moved to America years ago. She decided to travel far west, to the frontier. She writes to us sometimes, telling us about life out there. I wish to go someday. A dreaminess appeared in her gaze. It was gone in a flash. She has an inn. Recently, she started a mail order convoy. Women from different parts of America go to Huntsville and stay in her inn until they find suitable husbands. She says it's helpful to them because she knows most of the men in town, and she can easily tell what man would be suitable for the women. Annie could see where things were going. There's another one happening in a week. It only happens once a year. Maria's eyes bored into hers. You can find a way to flee. Go out west. He won't find you. Annie didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Minnie had traveled out west, and Geoffrey had found her. She'd been lucky enough to be found by her husband minutes before the train moved. He can. Maria rose. I don't know how to help you, miss. You can stay here and let him send you off to another country, or you can decide to leave. Annie was surprised by Maria's sudden brazenness. She watched as Maria scribbled something on a paper and handed it to her. That's my aunt's address. I've been thinking of how to tell you, but I didn't know how. Annie stared at the door long after Maria had left. She glanced at the paper in her hand. New Haven Inn, Huntsville. A mail order convoy? Annie's breath caught. She tried to breathe but couldn't seem to get enough air. Excitement and fear surged through her. There were so many risks. Could she do it? Could she dare try to escape the fate that had been imposed on her? She looked at the date. She had only 6 days to decide. Time was counting. Chapter 1. Jeff Higgins hated criminals. Sweat poured down his back as he trudged through the bushes, keeping his steps as light as possible. Moonlight filtered in through the canopy of trees. A hissing sound made him go still. He held his breath, hoping it wasn't a snake. He didn't need anything that would draw attention to where he was. This was where the action was happening. Here in the forest, miles away from the town. He'd done his homework. He'd been tailing Philip Garrett for weeks, keeping his ears close to the ground and picking up hints of what he did. Jeff had always suspected Philip was involved in a business other than the livery he operated. There was something very fishy about him. He took a step further, then another. His boots crunched the dry leaves, making a sound that was far too loud for comfort. He cringed with each step, hoping that wherever Philip was, he would assume the sound came from wild animals. Jeff took 3 more steps. A clearing in the bushes came into his line of sight. He held his breath, waiting. A shadowy figure appeared, then another. Jeff strained his ears to listen in on the exchange. Get the horses to you. I want them agile and young. Strong black horses. I get good horses for my customers. They win the races, and I win the bets. Don't disappoint me. Ah, it all fell into place. This was it. The last piece of the puzzle. The confirmation he'd needed. When reports had started coming in about horses getting stolen from the livery, Jeff had smelled foul. Then it happened over and over again. Philip's complaints didn't ring true. Jeff had always had a sixth sense about people, a trait he'd honed in his years as a lawman. The story hadn't made sense to him, but he'd done all he could. Followed the clues, asked questions, and tried to figure out how exactly the horses were getting stolen. He'd decided it was time for things to take a different turn. Then he'd followed his hunch and trailed Philip out here. I need to lay low a while. I've sold you too many horses, Reg. People are starting to get suspicious, especially the sheriff. The sheriff? He's been asking too many questions, trying to sniff me out or something. Cover your tracks. Sell me the horses or this deal is done. The figure handed a bundle to Philip. Jeff waited for a few beats. His heart picked up pace. This was it. The moment to catch these criminals and be the hero he was known as. He stepped out of the bushes. Howdy, gentlemen. Head snapped towards him. Philip's eyes widened. He started stuttering. Jeff? Jeff took a step toward the men. He turned to Reg. He couldn't make out his features clearly in the dark. Reg was short, light, with a posture that was akin to a man accustomed to being in control. Although Jeff couldn't see his face clearly, he felt the intensity of his stare. The temperature dropped. Tension thickened. So you've been the one stealing from those who trusted you to care for their horses. Jeff turned to Philip. His disgust was glaring. Sometimes he found it hard to wrap his head around how men could behave so terribly. Philip owned the only livery in Huntsville. a flourishing one at that, yet he stole from under their noses. "You shouldn't have done that, Philip. Now you're going to lose everything. You'll be going to jail for a long—" Jeff heard the click of a gun near his head. At that moment, he knew he'd made a horrible mistake. He'd underestimated Reg. The cold metal pressed into him, and he stilled. "You came alone." It wasn't a question. Reg knew he'd come alone. Jeff always worked alone. The rush he felt at fighting crime was second to none. He couldn't risk anyone else getting hurt. Burke would be very cross with him when he found out he'd hunted down suspects alone again. At that moment, he realized coming out here all by himself had been a terrible idea. "You shouldn't have come here, Sheriff." Jeff's heart thumped hard against his ribcage. Blood rushed to his ears. He kept his eyes fixed on Reg, who was now moving backward. "Handle this, Philip. I have things to do." He heard another click. Philip had come harmed. A rush of déjà vu came over him. He'd been in this position before. Still, with a gun to his head. Then he'd been terrified and inexperienced and frozen in fear of what would happen next. When the inevitable had happened, he'd been powerless to stop it. He'd watched those he loved fall to the ground like bundles of wheat. No. Not again. Jeff gritted his teeth. He kept his eyes on Philip and slowly inched his hand to his pocket. Philip couldn't see his movements in the dark. Jeff had learned an important lesson in his first year as deputy sheriff, to always keep an extra gun. His hand touched the cold metal. He kept his eyes fixed on Philip. Philip's hand shook slightly. He might be a thief, but he wasn't a killer. Jeff had a feeling he'd never had to shoot anyone before. He didn't want to bank on Philip's lack of experience. A man would do anything when stuck in a desperate situation. Jeff held up the gun. Philip's shock gave him enough leverage to take him by surprise. In one swift movement, he had Philip's hands behind his back. His gun was on the floor. Philip cried out in protest. He struggled, but Jeff tightened his grip on him. "Stay still." Jeff felt a familiar surge of victory. He'd won. He'd caught the criminal. And again, the townsfolk would be amazed because they had a bold and daring sheriff to protect them. "You could have been shot," Jeff groaned inwardly. Burke's frown seemed to have been carved on his face. He glared at Jeff. "I knew you were up to something." Jeff leaned back. He grinned, which he knew would only annoy Burke further. "Calm down, Burke. I caught the criminal. Everything's good." "Everything is not good, Jeff. You can't keep acting like you have 9 lives. Something could have gone wrong out there, and you'd only have yourself to blame." Burke's face relaxed. He opened his mouth to speak. Then he clamped it shut. He shook his head. "Why do I bother? You never listen." He opened the door. He was about to step outside when he turned back to look at Jeff. "I'm your deputy, Jeff. I'm supposed to assist you. How can I do my job if you're so hell-bent on doing everything on your own?" Burke gave him a pointed look. "You're careless because you think you don't have anyone who would be devastated if something bad happens to you." Although Jeff shrugged it off, Burke's words stayed with him. Burke was always incensed whenever he went after criminals all by himself, something he'd done more times than he could count. He couldn't risk anyone getting hurt because of him. The thought alone was unbearable. Minutes later, Burke entered the office again. His annoyance from earlier had disappeared. "I saw Mrs. Turton at the store earlier. She was impressed with the news of how you captured Philip. She's invited us to dinner," he grinned. "Again." Jeff released a deep, throaty chuckle. He loved his job. The intensity and tension of fighting crime always paid off afterward. The townsfolk were warm and receptive, and they never hesitated to lavish praise on him for his actions. "Mrs. Turton." He toyed with his badge. "Nice old lady." Burke crossed his arms. "She invited us to dinner, not to eat." Jeff had honored her invitation once. He hadn't gone back. It turned out the elderly woman was more concerned with having him as a son-in-law than treating him to a good meal. She hadn't even tried to be subtle. Jeff had suffered through hours of listening to all the details of her daughter's childhood. He'd smiled so much that his cheeks had hurt afterward. "You can go if you want, Burke." Maybe that would get Mrs. Turton off his tail. She could tell Burke all about her daughter's childhood instead. "That'll offend her. What will I tell her when she asks about you?" Jeff glanced out the window. Dusk had fallen. Darkness was creeping in on the town. He played with his badge, thinking, Tell her I need to rest." He shot to his feet. A hero needs his sleep. Burke didn't laugh. "Your loss. Her daughter is quite lovely. Pity she doesn't know you're determined to be forever alone." Burke's words rattled Jeff. He wasn't sure why. It wasn't until he'd stepped outside into the open air that he let himself think about it. Several mothers had tried matchmaking him with their daughters. He'd never encouraged them. They saw his actions and his reputation as a moral, thorough lawman. They didn't see the hard part of it. His life was constantly in danger. He couldn't expose an innocent woman to it. He reached home several minutes later. His house was a small building close to the middle of the town. Jeff paused at the door. The house was dark. A blast of warm air embraced him when he pushed the door open. There was no one waiting for him with an alluring smile and a warm meal. No lamp had been lit. He sensed the emptiness every time he came home at night. Jeff sat in the darkness for a while. Every day he went out to fight the world. For the most part, he was victorious, untouchable, important. Yet every time he came home, all he'd accomplished lost all meaning. Suddenly, Jeff wished he'd taken Mrs. Turton's offer. He wouldn't have to spend another night completely alone. Chapter 2. Annie. Annie. Maria's whisper woke her. Annie stared groggily at the blurry face of her maid. She was disoriented. What was happening? "You have to leave now." The traces of sleep vanished in a flash. Annie sat up. She glanced around her. Her trunk lay at the foot of the bed, neatly packed. She was fully dressed. She hadn't meant to sleep at all. After waiting for hours for Maria's signal, she'd finally fallen asleep, dreaming of mountains and horses and dancing with a handsome cowboy. "It's time to go." Annie's eyes widened. Now? It was still dark. Very dark. "It's not morning yet." Maria pulled her up. "If you don't leave now, you might never get another chance." Annie scrambled for her trunk. Her heart started beating wildly in her chest. She couldn't believe she was doing this, running away as her twin had. It was almost laughable. She, the gentle one. Her sisters would be shocked. The truth was, she would never have thought it through if Maria hadn't been insistent. At first, fear had gripped her in its jaws and prevented her from thinking straight. She was afraid of being sent off to a far country to marry whomever her cousin willed, and she was terrified of being caught by Geoffrey if she did attempt to flee. Oh goodness, what am I doing? Panic made her freeze to the spot. She couldn't do this. She sat on the bed and hugged herself, shaking. Geoffrey would catch her before she made it past the front door. And then what would he do? He'd become more violent lately. She didn't want to rile him up. Attempting to run away would most definitely anger him. "What are you doing?" Maria said from the doorway where she was lugging her trunk past. "You have to go now." She glanced at the trunk. "Isn't this too much?" Annie couldn't speak. If she could, she'd have told Maria she couldn't leave a thing behind. She'd hold on to all she had from her sisters: clothes, letters, favorite books, jewelry, and a lock of hair from Rose. She had to keep them all. Leaving them behind would be as though she were cutting ties with them completely. It would be unbearable. But she didn't think of that. She couldn't think of that. "If he wakes up," Maria's voice shook. Annie glanced at her. "What did you do?" "I drugged him." Her voice was clogged with tears. She looked like she couldn't believe she'd done such a thing. "He's fallen into a deep sleep. He won't wake until morning." Geoffrey had a new habit of walking the hallways at night. He was a sleepwalker. "You have to get to the train station and find a place to stay until morning." Maria darted a nervous glance outside the room. "You have to go now, or you'll never be able to leave." Annie forced herself to breathe. She couldn't believe she was doing this. Did she want to? Could she? What if? "Miss," Minnie's words from the letter echoed in her thoughts. "Flee, sister, flee." She stood. She forced her feet forward, fighting against the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She wouldn't sit around waiting for her fate. She had to take her life into her own hands, even if she was terrified. She heard Maria exhale in relief. Together, they made their way through the hallway, down the stairs, to the front door. There was no one there. Annie took one look at Maria and knew. She drugged the guard too. Even if she didn't want to leave, she had to for Maria's sake. The maid had sacrificed too much for her. "Oh, Maria." Annie's eyes filled with tears. "What will you do if he finds out?" Maria's smile was watery. "Don't worry about that. He won't." Annie clutched her hand. Words failed her. Maria nodded. Live for yourself." She paused. "My mother didn't, and she paid dearly with her life." Sadness coated her words. "I wish you well." Annie sucked in a breath. She glanced at the window to her uncle's room, half expecting him to jump out and drag her back inside. Seconds ticked by. Maria nudged her. Grasping her trunk with one hand, Annie took her first step towards freedom. She kept her head down as she walked, scared that at any moment someone would walk up to her and identify her as Geoffrey's cousin. Annie's breaths came in shallow bursts. She toed the streets, staying away from the dark corners. New York was different from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The unfamiliar streets were cold and dark. Danger lurked in every corner. The entire city was foreign to her. She hadn't stepped outside the house since her arrival. She hadn't known what to expect. A shadow breezed past a corner several feet from her. She gasped and shrunk back. Then she increased her pace and half ran through the dark streets. The past week had been a whirlwind of activity. She'd written and rewritten letters to her sisters, then had promptly decided against sending them. It had been a difficult decision, as she desperately wanted to include them in such a defining moment of her life. In the end, she'd decided against it. She would write to them when she was settled in a town far away from New York. At the thought of her destination, a rush of uncertainty gave her pause. Although she'd written to Maria's aunt, the time had been too short to wait for a reply. Maria had written a letter of her own to make things easier for her. She was traveling to the frontier, banking on the chance that the older woman would accept her. It was almost foolish. But, as Maria had reasoned, it was better than waiting for whatever Geoffrey was planning for her. She followed Maria's directions until she got to the train station. She paused for a few seconds, soaking it in. She'd done it. She'd done the most frightening thing she'd ever done. She'd defied Geoffrey. It was exhilarating. She inclined her head upwards at the sky and let out a low laugh. She would be a mail-order bride. She would be free to choose. She swept the scenery with her gaze. The station was dark and deserted. The steel rail tracks glimmered under the pale moonlight. She became all too aware of the risks of being out there all by herself. She needed a place to hide until morning. A figure appeared from nowhere. Annie's heart jumped. She stared at the approaching figure, unsure of whether or not to run. Then she reminded herself that people didn't know her here. No one would recognize her or drag her back to Geoffrey. She forced herself to breathe. "Miss?" He approached her. "Do you need something?" Annie cleared her throat. On a second glance, the station wasn't completely deserted. She could make out another figure in the dark. "Are you here to board the train?" She cleared her throat. "Yes." Her hand tightened reflexively on her luggage. "What time will it leave?" 6 a.m. We're all waiting here till morning. We live too far away to risk coming here tomorrow." Oh, relief flooded her. She wasn't alone. He gestured toward the platform. She squinted. It wasn't until she got closer that she noticed 2 other people on the platform. One of them, a woman, was sitting on her trunk and resting her head against a pole. "Tired, honey?" the man who'd brought her said. He placed a hand on his wife's shoulder. She muttered some words and touched his arm. Annie watched them for a while, warmed by the sight. It brought back memories of her parents and how much they'd loved each other. Then it had all ended when her mother died many years ago. Her father had passed away more than 6 months ago in a dock accident. That was the moment everything changed. Annie swallowed the lump in her throat. A chilly breeze blew on her skin, raising her hair slightly. She realized she'd been holding on to her trunk. She placed it on the floor. Her fingers were cramped from holding on to it so tightly. Soon, others were dozing off. Annie couldn't sleep all through the night. Each time dozed off, an image of someone grabbing her from behind would startle her awake. She kept her eyes peeled open for any sign of threat. By the time the first sign of dawn came, Annie was dead on her feet. With the onset of the morning came another wave of anxiety. Her cousin might have woken up and discovered she was missing. He could be in his stagecoach, headed towards the train station. He could be searching for her among the gathering crowd on the platform. He could be. It wasn't until she boarded the train that the anxiety fizzled away. When the train started to move, Annie knew she'd done it. She'd won. Now it was on to Huntsville, Utah, and the mail order convoy that awaited her. Chapter 3. Pay your tax, Mr. Bridges, or I'll have to claim your horse as mine. The old man barked a laugh. He shut the door to his store, chuckling. I hear you, Sheriff. His mirth died, and his face turned serious. Say I've been hearing news of people getting robbed at the tavern. Heard a few folks talking about it in my store yesterday. At first, I assumed it was just a case of a drunk man falling asleep on the road and losing his possessions to a rival at the card table. Jeff frowned. When did this happen? Bridges paused to think. About 3 days ago? I reckon it should be about that time. It wasn't reported? Bridges lifted a bag from the floor. It's getting worrisome, Jeff, the rates of thievery in the town. First, horses got stolen. Now, money and belongings. Gilbert says he's scared rustlers would start attacking ranches and stealing all the animals. It's a scary thought, 'cause the ranch is what my brother left for him. A family legacy. Jeff's heart sunk with every word Bridges uttered. How could he call himself a good sheriff if the townsfolk didn't feel their possessions were safe? Bridges turned to go, then paused. Gilbert told me a woman might be involved, young and beautiful, a soiled dove maybe. But no one knows who she is or where she's from. He shrugged. Perhaps it's just the ramblings of a drunk. A woman? That's what I heard. I remember now, it was Primus who was robbed. He lost quite a sum at the tavern last night. Jeff's frown deepened. Primus was a known drunk. He spent hours every day at the tavern or saloon and was often involved in brawls. He didn't have a stellar reputation as a hard-working man. Although he'd been in one too many brawls, Jeff went easy on him. Primus had lost his wife to an illness 8 months ago. He hadn't been the same since. Perhaps turning to the bottle was his own way of grieving. I'll look into it, Jeff said in a strained voice. He'd worked hard to keep the town safe. The townsfolk trusted him. He couldn't let them down this time. Planting his feet apart, he surveyed the surroundings. Horses trudged past at a lazy pace, and the townsfolk dragged their feet to their homes after a long, hard day. Jeff glanced at the sky. Dusk had fallen, throwing the town into a gray gloom. He couldn't wait any longer to catch the criminals. Tomorrow, he'd parade them in front of the townsfolk and watch their tension ease when they realized he'd saved them again. With a purposeful stride, Jeff started heading towards the tavern. He braced himself for the noise and pointless arguments of tired drunks. Jeff paused in front of the tavern. The loud shouts of men permeated the air, disrupting the relative calmness of the evening. He sucked in a breath. The swinging door of the tavern swung open, and a man staggered outside. Jeff stared at him in distaste. Was this truly the man he used to be? He shook his head, forcing his mind back to the task at hand. A shadowy figure caught his eye. Jeff squinted, watching as the shadow loomed closer. The faint moonlight lit up the figure. It was a woman. She turned, scanning the scenery. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. She was facing the direction the drunk had just gone. He waited for her to approach the drunk. Was this the woman robbing the townsfolks? Seconds ticked by. She didn't move. She whirled around suddenly. A sharp gasp escaped from her mouth. Her hand flew to her chest, and she took several steps back. Jeff studied her intently, tall and slender, with a heart-shaped face and eyes darker than the night. Those eyes were wide in surprise, or fear. He couldn't tell. "What are you doing here?" His voice was hard. He eyed her warily, fighting the urge to kick himself. He should have kept himself hidden, then arrested her after catching her in the act. If she hadn't robbed the drunk, he'd have followed her into the tavern and studied her movements for the rest of the night. It was too late now. She'd seen him. "I'm looking for the inn." Her voice shook slightly. Was she nervous? Afraid? His gaze dropped to her hands. She was lugging a small trunk. He took a step closer. Her dress was simple, but it spoke of an elegance he rarely saw. "Who are you?" She frowned. Her gaze darted to and fro as though she were searching for answers. "You came to steal," he cut in. She shrunk backward. "What?" She raised her gaze to his, her mouth open, then closed. What was she thinking of? A lie? "You came to the tavern." Her brows furrowed. "The tavern?" Jeff took another step closer to her. She stepped back. "You came to the tavern to rob men." He reached out to grab her arm. "Who are you working with?" She emitted a shocked gasp. "What are you doing?" She struggled against him. "Let me go." Jeff kept his hold firm. Did she think he was a fool? Here she was, trying to deceive him with a false display of innocence and thinking he'd fall for it. She tried jerking her arm away. "Let go of me." "Who is your partner?" The moonlight reflected a sheen of tears in her eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about. I came here to find Frida." Geoff loosened his hold on her. "Frida?" She eyed him with distaste. "Yes. You're new in town?" "Yes." Her eyes held his, then quickly dropped to her hands. Is Frida Wagner here? Are you a relative?" I know her niece, Maria." Geoff took another step closer. "Maria? Who is Maria?" Was my maid." "Maid? I came here to find her aunt, Frida. She has an inn." Geoff stared at her wordlessly. He didn't know what to say for the first few minutes. He scratched his head. "I'm sorry, miss. I thought you were a criminal." "Well, I'm not." She turned to go. Geoff reached out to grab her arm without thinking. "Wait, I can take you to Frida's inn." She snatched her hand away from him. "You'll get lost. You can't find the inn by yourself." Geoff exhaled loudly. "I'm the sheriff." She eyed him warily. "You're the sheriff?" I'll take you to the inn. It's not far." A long pause. Finally, she conceded. "All right." He reached for her trunk. His hand touched hers for a brief moment before she snatched her hand away. They walked in silence for a few minutes. Geoff's head had gone blank. What could he say to a woman he'd just accused of thievery? "Huntsville is a lovely place. You're here to visit?" She didn't respond immediately. "No." Geoff racked his brain for what to say. Nothing else came to mind. After a few minutes, he gave up trying. There was no salvaging the terrible impression he'd made. He might as well not try. Minutes later, they reached the inn. He went up to the porch and knocked on the door. Frida opened the door with a wide smile. Her white blonde hair was pulled into an austere bun. "Sheriff, what a pleasure." Geoff gestured to the young woman. "I brought a guest." It was then he realized she hadn't told him his name. Frida stepped forward with her arms opened wide. "Annie MacPherson? It's wonderful to meet you. Come in, come in. The others are already here." The others? Was Frida holding a party? In a blink, Annie had disappeared into the inn. He hadn't even gotten the chance to apologize. "Thank you for leading her here, Sheriff. The mail order convoy is a success." Geoff frowned. "Mail order convoy?" Frida nodded. Half the men in town would be married soon." "You should take advantage of this opportunity, Sheriff." Her eyes gleamed. "You might have started already." Chuckling, he stepped off the porch. "Good night, Mrs. Wagner." Annie MacPherson. Her name echoed in his head all through his walk home. He had a good feeling she'd never wish to speak to him again, not after what had happened tonight. Chapter 4. Annie woke up with a start. She placed a hand on her chest, willing her racing heart to slow. She dreamed she hadn't made it to Huntsville, that Geoffrey had found her and taken her back home and then sent her to London to marry a boring old man, the exact thing that would have happened if she hadn't left. She swung her legs off the bed and onto the floor. Sunlight brightened up the room, which was barely half the size of her room in New York. The walls were a soft butter color, and there was nothing in the room apart from a small closet, a chair, and a table. It had none of the luxuries she'd had back home, but here, for the first time in a while, she was at peace. She drew the curtains open further. The town was wide awake. She watched the townsfolk milling about on the streets, tossing cheery greetings with wide smiles. As the minutes passed, her mood lightened. The heaviness in her chest lifted, and her lips spread in a smile. She could be happy here. She would be happy here. Someone knocked on her door. "Are you awake, Annie?" Frida's voice floated from the other side of the door. "Breakfast is ready, and everyone's downstairs. They're all excited to meet you." "I'll be there in a few minutes," she said. Excitement thrummed through her. She'd be meeting other members of the mail order convoy today, women from different places and with different stories, but who had a common goal: to find happiness in marrying a man of their choosing. Staring at her reflection, she packed her hair in a bun. Her gaze drifted to her left arm, and the events of last night rushed to the forefront of her thoughts. Her mood soured. The sheriff's hard face surfaced in her mind's eye. What a charming man, she thought with a grimace. He'd labeled her a thief. How ludicrous. After ensuring she was presentable, Annie rushed out of the room. 7 other women were gathered around the table. Annie greeted them with a bright smile. Frida placed an arm around her shoulder. "This is Annie, from New York." She gestured to a sweet-faced blonde on the far right of the table. That's Hannah, Edith, Susanna, Rebecca, Charlotte, Jane, and Laura. Annie sat down amidst cheery greetings and smiles. She sat next to the blonde, who leaned in and whispered, "I'm from New York, too." Annie grinned. "Well, I'm originally from New Hampshire, but I traveled here from New York." Her smile slipped. What was happening at home right now? Her heart clenched painfully at the memory of the sisters she'd left behind. By now, Geoffrey would be looking for her. He might have returned to New Hampshire to ask her sisters about her whereabouts. Her thoughts drifted to Maria. What had her cousin done to her? Had she been fired? "What type of man would you want to marry, Annie?" Susanna asked softly. Annie blinked. All eyes were on her. She racked her brain for an answer. A good man." They stared at her expectantly. She paused to think. What kind of man would she like? She'd been so focused on getting out of Geoffrey's plans for her that she hadn't thought much about it. She hadn't even let herself hope she'd be able to choose a man for herself. "I'd like a man who is kind, who does all he can to protect those he loves, and who cares deeply for me." Their encouraging smiles and nods pleased her immensely. "Well, I'd like a ruggedly handsome cowboy with bright blue eyes who will sweep me off my feet," Edith, the tall brunette, said. They all laughed. "I might just know the right man for you, Edith," Frida said with a wink. Gradually, Annie relaxed. The conversation flowed freely. The women swapped stories of their lives back home and what had prompted them to travel to the frontier in search of husbands. Towards the end of the meal, Frida clapped her hands. All eyes turned to her. "Welcome to Huntsville. I am happy to have you here, truly happy indeed. I started the Mail Order Convoy years ago to ensure wonderful women make life on the frontier 1,000 times better by marrying our men. I'm still amazed by the drastic change that happens whenever these men find themselves in the presence of beautiful young women. I hope your dresses are ready, because tonight we're having our first party. This is the chance to meet the gentlemen in Huntsville and to get acquainted with them." She placed a hand on her chest. "Let's see if the fires of love would be set ablaze on your first day." Her pitch rose dramatically, earning a giggle from the women. "Perhaps you'll meet your dashing cowboy tonight, after all." Edith blushed. "I sure hope so." "Well, I'd like to marry a farmer," Charlotte piped up, curling a strand of brown hair around her fingers. "I grew up on a farm in Mississippi, so I think it's suitable." "Me too," Rebecca said. "Not in Mississippi, though," she added with a grin. "I'm great with animals, especially horses." "Maybe you should marry a cowboy," Laura teased. Soon Annie was so lost in the conversation that she stopped thinking of Maria, her sisters, and her scheming cousin. The excitement sucked her in, and she let herself get lost in daydreams of charming young men and beautiful dances, and of how wonderful it would be to fall in love with a gentleman she'd meet tonight. Chapter 5. Jeff went to the tavern the next night, prepared to catch the criminal once and for all. He'd tossed and turned for most of the night, thinking of ways to stop the thefts. Although no other case had been reported that day, Jeff didn't want to take any chances. The first thing he noticed when he entered the saloon was the silence. Half the tables had no one sitting on them. The air was devoid of the stench of sweat and strong ale. The place was almost empty. Jeff scanned the men littering the saloon. He couldn't believe his eyes. Primus wasn't among the men. "Sheriff," Simon said, handing a mug to a man sitting on one of the bar stools. "Fancy seeing you here on the driest of nights." Jeff approached the owner of the business. Simon slid the mug to the man seated at the far end. The door opened. Jeff turned to the newcomer, expecting Primus to walk in, followed quickly by others. A small, thin man walked in, headed to Simon and asked for a drink. Jeff drummed his fingers on the bar top, glancing at the door ever so often. No one else entered. "No brawls tonight?" Simon placed a glass on the table. He spread his hand around the half-empty saloon. "Not enough customers for a brawl." Jeff frowned. An older man seated on a bar stool far away was staring somberly at his glass. A group of older men sat at a table mumbling amongst themselves. They nodded at him. "I doubt any of these men could throw a punch or argue over pointless things." Simon chuckled. "The older you are, the lesser your ego, something my pa used to say." Simon pointed at the drink. "Red-eye, on the house." When Jeff made no move to take it, he shrugged. Never met a man who doesn't drink until you came along." Jeff's laughter was dry. Simon knew little. Too little. He glanced at the glass. The liquid shimmered under the golden light of the lanterns hung along the walls of the tavern. His throat was dry. He needed a drink. A sip wouldn't hurt, would it? He quickly glanced away from the drink, swallowing. It's odd that there aren't any customers, and no brawls. Jeff rubbed his forehead. What's happening? There's no rodeo, no barn raising, and no event that is interesting enough to steal young men from their drinks. The prospects of getting a bride could. What? Simon raised a brow. He wiped a glass with a napkin and placed it on a tray. Have you been living underground, Sheriff? You can blame it on Frida. She's holding a party at the inn. I hear she has a bunch of women from the east looking for husbands. Turns out half the men in town are hungry for a bride. The mail order convoy. How could he have forgotten? Annie's face flashed in his mind. He cringed inwardly, recalling the events of the previous night. Being wrongfully accused of a crime immediately after arriving in a new town wouldn't have endeared her to the town or to him. Well, I'm not needed here then. You could go to the party, Simon said. I hear the women are such beauties. I'd go myself, but I have a wife already. Can't have you arresting me for bigamy, eh? He laughed at his own joke. You could stop by the inn, Jeff. You might find yourself a wife. I doubt they'd turn down Huntsville's sheriff. I have work to do. Then he stepped out of the saloon. The night's quietness unsettled him. His gaze flitted from one end of the street to the other, searching for a threat or a sign that something was wrong. A wagon trudged past him. The driver's whistling disturbed the night's calmness. The night stretched before him. Jeff paused in front of the tavern. There was no crime to fight, no brawls to stop, and no criminal to put behind bars. His shoulders drooped, and he started heading toward home. What would he do all night? He'd turned down another invitation to dinner with the excuse of working late. Now his hopes of catching the criminals had plummeted. The thief wouldn't operate if there was no one to steal from. He stopped in his tracks. If the thief wasn't at the tavern, he'd be where the crowd was, the inn. Several men would be distracted by the mail-order brides, allowing the criminal to rob unsuspecting townsfolk. Turning, Jeff headed toward the inn. A sense of urgency spurred him on, and he quickened his pace. The closer he got, the less quiet the night became. The small building seemed almost alive as he got closer. Light escaped from the windows and lit up some parts of the surroundings. The sound of music and conversation greeted him as he neared the porch. Jeff paused in front of the door. He raised his hand to knock, then stopped. What would Annie feel if she saw him at her party? He dropped his fist. Maybe he shouldn't have come. He turned to go, then changed his mind. He'd come here for a purpose, and he'd get it done. Plus, he hadn't apologized for his error last night. The door opened after the fourth knock. You came. What a wonderful surprise. Frida's smile was wide. She waved him in. Come in, come in. Indeed, this was where the tavern had been emptied into. The parlor was filled with the men he'd seen several times at the tavern. Jeff stared at them in surprise. The men were groomed to perfection. Their clothes were ironed sharply, hair combed back, faces cleaner than he'd ever seen. His gaze landed on Primus, who was known for sporting an ever-growing beard. Jeff's jaw went slack. Primus's beard had been chopped in half. He was grinning and in deep conversation with a tall brunette in a dark green dress. It's wonderful, isn't it? Frida said, beaming. I've done this for years. I consider it my purpose, even if it means I have to move to a new town once in a while. You're doing a huge favor to all the men in the West, Frida chuckled. Someday I'll have a bigger inn so I can host more women. When I die, I want to be remembered as the woman who brought families together. Her words struck a chord within him. What did he want to be remembered as? A man who fought bravely to keep the townsfolk safe. A brave man, a hard-working man, a lonely man. Hannah, have you met the sheriff? Frida said, distracting him from his somber thoughts. She gestured to a petite blonde. I haven't had the pleasure. Hannah's voice was silky smooth with a richness he was unaccustomed to. He extended a hand, smiling politely. Welcome to Huntsville. Where's she? Frida said, glancing around. Leaving Jeff with Hannah, she walked away, muttering to herself. You're the sheriff, Hannah said, glancing at him from beneath her lashes. Do you always fight criminals? Jeff's gaze danced around the room. "I'm searching for one right now," Hannah gasped. She leaned towards him, wide-eyed. "You mean there's a criminal here?" "Be rest assured, ma'am, you have nothing to worry about," Hannah giggled. "I'm not worried. I'm sure you'll catch him. Oh, this is so exciting." Jeff was about to respond when a collective gasp drew his attention to the stairs. His breath caught as he stared at the woman at the top of the stairs. A yellow dress draped softly down her body, cinching at her waist and flowing gently down her legs. Her gaze roamed the crowd before landing on his. A lightness spread through Jeff's chest. Frida whispered in her ear, touching her arm gently. She started walking down the stairs. Her hands shook slightly and her lips parted. Jeff followed her with his gaze until she reached the base of the stairs before she was blocked from view by a group of gentlemen clamoring for attention. Prosody %. "My Annie could definitely get a husband tonight," Hannah said. Jeff's chest clenched painfully. He said dryly, watching Annie. He shouldn't be bothered. She was a mail-order bride. She'd traveled to Huntsville to get a husband. A man led Annie to the middle of the room for a dance. Jeff's chest tightened uncomfortably as he watched her in another man's arms. Her eyes met his, and her brows furrowed in a subtle frown. Jeff looked away. What was he thinking, anyway? He didn't come here looking for a bride. He came here searching for a criminal. He glanced beside him. Hannah was nowhere to be found. Then he saw her in someone's arms, laughing. Jeff shook his head. He leaned against the wall, studying the men. All the men had their attention on the women, waiting their turn for a dance or a conversation. His gaze flitted to Annie several times. Her face was aglow with smiles, and her eyes danced with delight. Who was the man she was with, anyway? He had a head of dark curls, and he stood several inches taller than Annie. Jeff tried to make out the rest of his features, but the man had his back turned to him. Jeff didn't know how long he stayed until Frida came to stand beside him. "Won't you dance with any of them?" Jeff shook his head. "I'm not here to dance. I'm looking for someone." Frida raised a brow. I'm certain the person has gotten away because you've had your eye on one person throughout the evening." Jeff glanced across the room. Annie was smiling, nodding to the words of her companion. He hadn't left her side all night. Couldn't he let her be so she'd get the chance to speak to other men? Annie looked up, and their eyes locked. Her smile disappeared. Jeff's heart dropped to his stomach. I have to go," he said, looking away from her. He gave Frida a watery smile. "You're right, the person's not here." Frida eyed him quizzically. She angled her head, and mirth danced in her gray eyes. "Maybe you'll find this person tomorrow." Jeff ignored her cryptic words and left. He paused outside the inn. The tightness in his chest didn't feel any better. Annie didn't like him. Why should she? He jumped to conclusions about her without giving her a chance to defend herself. His apology hadn't been enough. He hesitated for a second before returning to the inn. Annie remained seated beside the curly-haired man. Her gestures were light, graceful, and effortless. She stopped talking when she saw him. "One moment, please," Jeff said to the man beside her. "I'd like to speak with Annie for a minute." Annie didn't look at him after her companion left. She sat straight-backed, head high, her eyes straight ahead. Jeff floundered for words. "I wanted to apologize for last night's misunderstanding. I shouldn't have been so quick to assume." When she didn't respond, he said, "I hope the incident doesn't give you a false perception of me. I'm not usually quick to accuse strangers of thievery." Her dark eyes finally met his before darting away to focus on her clasped hands. "It's all right. You were trying to protect your town." A hesitant smile curved her lips. Jeff's heart leaped for joy. His heart thrummed, and the weight in his chest lifted. He stood. "If there's anything you need or you notice anything suspicious, you can let me know." Annie's smile widened, her eyes softened. "Thank you, Sheriff." "Jeff," he said, grinning foolishly. "My name's Jeff." When he finally left the inn, he had a huge smile on his face. Chapter 6. Annie's head was abuzz. A chill ran through her spine when Shelby touched her hand. She cast her gaze downwards, looking at their entwined hands. Her hand was small and fragile in his. He stroked her palm, smiling into her eyes. "You're a wonderful woman, Annie. Phenomenal." Annie's heart fluttered. The world around her blurred. It was just her, him, and the warmth his words sent through her. He'd won her over from the moment he'd rescued her from a man droning on about his job as a foreman, and she'd been smitten. She'd never met such a man. His green eyes drew her in, and she fell into their depths. What did the sheriff want? He apologized for mistaking me for someone else. She waved it off. You don't live in Huntsville? I don't stay in town. I travel between states. He ran a hand through his dark curls. Isn't it wonderful how fate brought me here on the exact day this party happened? If I'd gotten here a day late, you'd have gotten married. A beautiful woman like you would be highly sought after. Annie laughed softly. She'd danced with a few men and conversed with them, but none of them had impressed her half as much. She looked into his green eyes, which seemed to be smiling at her. He raised her hand to his lips. It's late. I have to go. Shelby rose. I'll see you again. When? Annie said breathlessly. When will I see you again? He smiled, and her heart stopped beating. Soon, Annie. Very soon. Annie watched him go, a mix of emotions coursing through her. He was wonderful. And strange, too. The air of mystery around him only drew her in further. She'd met more men tonight than she had in a long time, and none of them had been half as charming. Soon the party was over. The women started retiring to their rooms. Susanna hummed cheerily, twirling happily, her expression filled with wistful longing. Laura and Edith hurried after her, hand in hand, whispering to each other and giggling. Annie stifled a yawn, dragging herself up the stairs. Hannah caught up with her. I think he fancies you, Hannah said, grinning. From the moment you appeared, he couldn't take his eyes off of you. I could as well have been a fly. Annie laughed. Oh, stop it, Hannah. You're gorgeous, Hannah giggled. I know. Her cheeks turned red. When I saw him, I thought, what a man, but he only had eyes for someone else. She sighed dreamily. He's quite handsome, isn't he? Tall and mysterious and dark, and oh, those coal dark eyes. Do you think he has a brother? Heat flooded Annie's cheeks. Hannah nudged her and laughed. You like him. Look at your cheeks. Annie laughed. I can see why the town made him the sheriff. Annie's smile disappeared. The sheriff? Hannah nodded. Then her brows squished together. Who did you think I meant? Not what. Who. But Annie didn't say a word. The sheriff had been staring at her. His earnest expression when he'd tendered his apology stirred her heart. Although he hadn't created a good first impression, he'd been humble enough to apologize for his mistake. Humility is an endearing trait in a man, her father used to say. Hannah saw right through her. You're thinking of the other man, aren't you? The one you spoke with all night? Annie shrugged. Perhaps. Well, you'd have to ask Frida about him. She says she never recommends a man she doesn't know. Before you arrived, I heard Frida asking who he was when he was at the door. Annie stopped in front of her room. Frida doesn't know everyone, Hannah. She opened the door. When he returns, she'll know all she needs to know about him. When would that be? Annie paused. I don't know, but he'll be back soon. That's what he said. Annie sat by the window side, staring out the window for any signs of him. She heaved a long sigh, her heart sinking as the afternoon passed. 5 days had passed. Still, Shelby hadn't returned. You're still waiting for him, Hannah said from across the parlor where she sat knitting with Frida. No, not like that, Frida said, squinting at Hannah's work. Relax your hand a little. There you go. She glanced at Annie. What's that young man's name again? Shelby, Annie said. He promised to return soon. Don't measure a man by his words, Annie, but by his actions. That's what I told Charlotte yesterday. They all glanced at Charlotte. She didn't look up from her book. Frida chuckled. She'll end up marrying one of the men in the books she reads. Annie, get over this fleeting feeling. Move on with your life. There are other bachelors in town that are eager to court you. Don't waste time waiting for someone who may not return. Annie's shoulders slumped. She tilted her chin downwards, staring at the floor. She'd waited for Shelby for days, rushing out of bed every morning with the hope that he'd arrive that day. And every day after nightfall, she went to bed disappointed. It was disheartening. He'd said so many things and made so many promises. How could he have disappeared? The neighs of horses piqued her interest. She rushed to the door and paused as a carriage stopped in front of the inn. A brown-haired man dressed impeccably in a black suit and a fedora hat stepped out of the carriage. He removed the cigar from his mouth, adjusted his hat, and approached the inn. Annie's heart sank. She returned to her seat by the window, staring forlornly at Charlotte, who sat in a corner reading a book, completely oblivious to her surroundings. The flowery scent filled the room, drawing her attention to Susanna descending the stairs. She was aglow with smiles, adorned in a pretty yellow dress with her hair styled wonderfully. Rebecca patted Susanna's hair, smoothed her dress, and gave her a pinch on the cheeks. "I think you need more carminic acid. It'll add more color to your lips," Rebecca said, frowning. Susanna laughed. "Stop fussing, Rebecca. You've done your best. You should get ready for your outing tomorrow." Frida stood to admire her. My, aren't you a work of art?" Her eyes danced with admiration. Susanna did a little twirl. Her cheeks were rosy, her eyes bright with delight. The gentleman stepped in. He filled the doorway, his gaze roaming the room before finally falling on Susanna's. His dark eyes lit up, and a smile crossed his lips. "Stunning," he said huskily. Susanna blushed beet red. After exchanging pleasantries with Frida, he extended a hand to her and they left the inn. Annie stared after them, envy spreading through her. Her ribs squeezed tight against her heart. Here she was, waiting for Shelby to arrive, while the other women went out with various gentlemen. Would she have to wait forever? "It's just been 5 days," she murmured under her breath. It felt like forever. "Shelby," Frida said long after Susanna had left. "What's his surname?" Annie hesitated. I don't know." Heat flooded her cheeks. She stared at her clasped hands, biting her lip. How could she not know the name of the man she was pining for? "Where's he from?" "Around here." Frida gave her a questioning look. "Around here?" "He says he's from out of town. He travels frequently." "Is he married?" Annie gasped. Unfazed, Frida shrugged and returned to her knitting. "I've been doing this for years, Annie. I know about these things. Even when I move to a new town, I wait until I know enough about the townsfolk before organizing a mail order convoy. Why? Because I won't be at peace if I hand over wonderful women like you, who left their homes and families with the hopes of matrimony, to men I don't know. Annie, not all men are good men, even when they seem to be." He's good," Annie said weakly. "He's a good man. You'll see." Frida shook her head. She exchanged a glance with Hannah. "I don't think it's wise to continue waiting for him. There are other men." "Yes," Hannah chirped in. "Like the sheriff." "The sheriff?" "He accused me of being a thief on my first night here." Annie wished she could retract her statement. He'd apologized. It wasn't fair to dig up old skeletons. Frida emitted a hearty chuckle. "Jeff is quite zealous when it comes to his job. He takes his work very seriously. I often wonder if he does anything aside from putting the well-being of others first. A selfless man he is." Well, he had offered to escort her to the inn when it was clear he was out searching for a criminal. Perhaps he'd only done that to assuage his guilt. Even if Frida was keen on him, she couldn't mistake his kindness for interest. She stayed in the parlor long after Frida and Hannah had left. Finally, she gave up and got to her feet. The door burst open. Annie turned towards the doorway. Her heart stopped, warmth coursed through her, and her breath seized for a few short seconds. "Shelby," she breathed. He stood before her, tall and handsome, with tousled hair and beautiful eyes. He didn't look at anyone else, just her. "Annie," he said, rushing to her side. "I waited for you." Shelby glanced out the window. "I've been wishing to see you." He pulled her away from the window. Reaching into his pockets, he held out a necklace. Annie gasped, reaching out to touch it. It had tiny jewels, the colors changing as light reflected on it. He placed it in her hand. "Is this for me? Keep this. I'll be back for you." Shelby planted a kiss on her forehead and hurried toward the door. "Let's go, Shelby," a woman said. Annie rushed after him. There was a woman riding shotgun in the coach, her painted face pulled into a scowl directed at Shelby. Annie frowned. Who was she, and why was Shelby going with her? "Shelby, where are you going?" But he was already gone. The coach pulled away, the horses' hooves leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Annie was speechless. She stared at the necklace in her palm, dumbfounded. Shelby was coming back for her. Did that mean he wished to marry her? Would he take her away from Huntsville? She curled her fingers around the necklace. Time would tell. The only thing she had to do was wait. Chapter 7. You're certain this happened at midnight? Gilbert scratched his beard, nodding. I was fast asleep when I heard a loud crashing sound. It was loud enough to wake Tilly, and Tilly's a heavy sleeper. I rushed out immediately and I saw a shadow. A shadow? The old man nodded. I could have sworn someone was trying to get in, then he ran off when I stepped out of the farmhouse with a lamp. Of course, I couldn't run after him. Jeff walked the entire length of the paddock, checking for any sign of forced entry. Satisfied that nothing was amiss, he turned to the old rancher. None of the animals was stolen? None, I fear for next time. I don't know if I'll be so lucky. Jeff looked up as Burke approached. The barn's all right, too. Jeff exhaled in relief. Rustlers. He hated those more than anything else. He loathed all criminals, but rustlers and land grabbers were the worst of them all. His lips curled in distaste. You need a stronger fence, Gilbert. These sticks won't protect your ranch against rustlers. He kept his voice calm, devoid of the anger churning through him. Gilbert's face tightened. Had this fence since my pa's days. Jeff forced a smile. I'm sure your pa would want the animals to be safe, wouldn't he? He beckoned to Burke. I'll speak to Bridges about the barbed wire fence. He'll know how to get all you need. Burke will stop by tomorrow to inform you of any progress. Gilbert squeezed Jeff's extended hand. Thank you, Sheriff. Jeff mounted his horse. Waving goodbye to the older man, he kicked his horse and rode away, Burke only a few steps behind him. The wind rushed at him as he rode through the prairie, past dancing trees and stubby shrubs. When he got to the edge of town, he sucked in a breath, visibly relaxing. It was a wonder that he'd once loved living on a farm. Now that life was long gone, and his memories were haunted by violence and crime and the screams of loved ones. Gilbert didn't seem very eager about getting a new fence, Burke said as they slowed down to a leisurely pace. He's a rigid old man, he is. He'll come around. I wish I could put a stop to rustling forever. He noticed Burke's raised brow and laughed. I wish we could put an end to all criminal activity. A carriage passed by. A young woman sat in the carriage in a lilac dress, her dark hair resting on her shoulders. Jeff's heart lurched. Was that Annie? He willed her to look at him. The woman turned slightly. It wasn't Annie. He looked away in disappointment. Annie MacPherson, he thought, mulling over her name. Her face floated in his mind, sweet and flawless, with the most wonderful eyes he'd ever seen. Warmth spread through him. Ask Bridges if he can get the wire. Jeff? Jeff blinked. They were in front of the office. He dismounted from his horse and followed Burke into the office. Jeff hardly heard a word, Burke said. Thoughts about Annie plagued his mind. Was she being courted already? Days had passed since he'd last seen her, and she'd been smiling at a man he didn't know. He wouldn't be surprised if someone was sitting her already. Danny's found his bride, Burke said, snapping Jeff out of his thoughts. I think it's the dark-haired one. We'll have a wedding soon. Jeff's head snapped to Burke. Who? Danny and one of the mail-order brides. I never caught her name. Even Primus is keen on one of them. Saw him in dapper-looking clothes today. Do you think I should get a bride myself? Jeff shot to his feet. I need to check on the guests at the inn. Burke shot him a quizzical look. Someone complained about something? Jeff neatly placed the stacks of books on his desk. He held up his gun, hesitated, then placed it on the desk. Prosody rate %. Burke raised a brow. You're going out without your gun? Jeff smoothed his shirt, peering at the stain on his left collar. Picking up a rag, he dabbed at it. Burke squished his brows together. Since when did you care about stains on your shirt? Are you going to dinner? His lips spread. Ah, has our sheriff set his sights on one of the mail-order brides? Jeff chuckled. I'll see you tomorrow, Burke. Jeff hurried toward the inn. Images of Annie in a wedding dress, standing right next to Danny, or any other man, made his insides clench. He was halfway there when it suddenly occurred to him. What would he say he'd gone there to do? Frida hadn't invited him for dinner, so showing up at the inn with no explanation might be awkward. He was the sheriff. He could show up anywhere. Routine check. That'd be his excuse. Thinking of Annie made him smile, and he kept smiling until he got to the inn. Perhaps he could court Annie if she was willing. He'd never been so intrigued by a woman before. If he didn't move fast enough, she'd be married to another person, and he'd have to get accustomed to seeing her around town with her husband. Bracing himself, Jeff walked up the porch and knocked. The door opened to reveal Frida's smiling face. Her eyes lit up when she saw him. Sheriff! 2 visits in 1 week. What a pleasure. Jeff grinned. I wanted to see if everyone is doing all right. Can't afford to not look after our guests. Frida nodded. Yes, of course. Please come in. Jeff stepped into the inn. A piano was playing in the background. Soft music filled the room, creating a soothing ambiance. Jeff stood rooted to the spot. Annie sat behind the piano with her eyes closed, her eyelashes resting on her cheeks. Long, graceful fingers stroked the keys, and she swayed slightly from side to side. Her face was serene, peaceful, and calming. Jeff took a step closer. The music turned moody, and sadness painted soft strokes on her features. Why was she sad? What was she thinking about? Jeff itched to reach out to her, to soothe her pain in whatever way he could. He watched, spellbound, as she continued playing. Then the music faded away, and she exhaled audibly, as though the music had brought her relief. That was beautiful, Jeff said, breaking the silence. Her eyes snapped open with a gasp. Surprise flitted across her features, and she placed her hands on her lap. Sheriff, she said, breathless. Jeff, he corrected, approaching her. Forgive me, I have been listening for a while. Annie blushed and stared at her hands. That was wonderful, Annie. I'm sure Frida would agree. He glanced back, only to see that Frida had completely disappeared. He shook his head, chuckling. She was here a few seconds ago. At least I thought she was. The sound of joyful laughter floated down the stairs. Jeff glanced up, expecting to see the women coming downstairs. Footsteps thudded on the floor above them with a muffled giggle and loud whispers. Seems everyone is having a grand time here. Huntsville is a wonderful town, very peaceful too. Jeff thought of the attempted rustling and grimaced. If she thought the town was peaceful, perhaps he was doing a better job than he thought. The jewel thief crossed his mind. News hadn't been heard of the thief in days. Someone had reported a stolen necklace, a family heirloom. The other victims had complained to him, angry at the injustice of their hard-earned valuables being stolen from them, and he'd promised to find the thief, even if he wasn't sure how to. I'm glad Frida brought us all together. I've made a few friends. Frida's very kind. You don't seem too happy. Annie's sigh was heavy. She trailed a finger on the old piano, her expression turning wistful. I like this place. I do. The ghost of a smile tainted her lips. I have met some wonderful people here. Jeff found himself hoping he was one of those wonderful people. You miss home. Annie's eyes locked with his. Yes. She sat on the chair, staring forlornly at her hands. I miss my sisters. They must be so worried. I haven't spoken to them in a while. You could write to them. Her eyes flitted to his, heavy with sadness. She opened her mouth, then clamped it shut. Jeff waited for her to speak. Seconds ticked by. I'm sure they miss you as much as you miss them. Sometimes home calls to us when we least expect it. He repeated the words he'd heard from a stranger long ago, and sometimes it's a call you can never heed. Her eyes locked with his. He held his breath, and something passed between them. He racked his head for something to say to fill the silence. Annie glanced away, biting her lip. Dinner's ready, Frida said from the kitchen. A few seconds later, the women came down the stairs. They flashed big smiles at Jeff. Good evening, Sheriff, Hannah said, grinning. She shot Annie a questioning look before following the others to the dinner table. Join us, Frida said, beckoning to him. Jeff hesitated. I wouldn't want to impose. Frida waved it off. It's always a pleasure. Jeff sat next to Annie with Hannah on his other side. Annie was quiet all through dinner. Jeff willed her to look at him, but she kept her attention on her food. Pushing around her meal, she stared forlornly at the plate. Poor thing, Hannah whispered to him, sighing. She's thinking of him again. Jeff raised a brow. Him? Hannah nodded, darting a glance at Annie. He hasn't visited or sent a letter since our first party. Annie fell in love at first sight. Coldness spread in Jeff's gut. Annie was in love with someone else? Who? A sense of loss weighed on him, and a niggling curiosity. Who is he? His voice was gruff, hard. Hannah shrugged, spooning some soup into her mouth. She waited a few seconds before answering. His name is Shelby. That's all we know about him. I don't think Frida knows him much. Annie has been waiting for him to return since the party. She's quite smitten by him. Jeff frowned. Who was this Shelby? And how had he stolen Annie's affection so quickly? He stole a glance at Annie. Their eyes locked and his stomach clenched. He wouldn't give up so quickly. Not until she made her choice. Chapter 8. Dearest Minnie, it feels like years have passed since we've written to each other. A lot has happened since you sent your last letter. You'll be glad to know that I've done as you suggested. I've left New York. It was a daring escape, one that I would never have embarked on if the maid hadn't pushed me. It's a lot to tell, a lot. I'm safe now. I'm in Huntsville. I miss you very much, and I miss our sisters too. I haven't written to them since I arrived for fear of Geoffrey finding out where I am and scolding them for it. I do not wish to get them in more trouble than they might be. Oh, I worry so much about them. Has Geoffrey taken one of my younger sisters to replace me? Will he send them off to a far country and spread us out so it is next to impossible for us to find each other? These questions always run through my mind every day. During the day, it's easier to pretend my life here in Huntsville is all that matters, when truly I'm afraid of what might be going on at home. And about Huntsville, well, it has been quite an adventure. The women here at the inn are very kind, and we've become fast friends, especially Hannah, a sweet person with whom I've had an enjoyable time. Frida, the woman that brought us all together, is very thorough about helping us choose the men to marry. Two of the women informed her of their budding romances last night during dinner. You should have seen Frida completely reject one by calling him a lazy alcoholic bum. It was quite laughable, although Rebecca was red in the face for a greater part of the meal. Frida, being a motherly person, quickly comforted her and told her she'd find a better man who was more suitable. Edith is already courting a handsome cowboy just like she'd wanted. Ah, I can see the questioning look on your face. I'm afraid I haven't found a husband yet, not for lack of trying, as Frida has opened the doors to visits from the town's bachelors. Yet my heart pines for one man, Shelby. Hannah says the feeling is fleeting. I did not agree at first. Now I'm not so sure. And there's another man. I don't want to rush. Every day I sit and hope for Shelby to arrive, just as he'd promised. But, as Frida says, it may not be wise to wait. She knows nothing about him, so she isn't keen on him. I suppose she is right. Pining after him has blinded me to the other men coming to visit, especially the sheriff. Frida is very fond of him. She's told me many things about him, including how he started working as a ranch hand before becoming a lawman, and how much he's done for the townsfolk. He is very brave, she says, and kind too. The sheriff has been coming to visit quite often, sometimes staying for dinner. At first, I assumed he fancied Hannah because they were always speaking in whispers at the dinner table. Now I'm not certain what to think. He always tries to speak with me, and I have caught him looking at me several times. I have to confess, Minnie, that I enjoy his company the most. He hasn't asked to court me, so I do not want to get ahead of myself as I did with Shelby. Hannah asked me last night what would happen if Shelby did return. Would I happily fall into his arms without thinking twice, or would I realize I've given my heart to another? I do not know. I am confused, Minnie, very confused indeed. But, as Frida wisely says, true love would always show itself. I only hope I won't be blind to it. After reading through the letter, Annie folded it and kept it in a drawer. She'd go to the post office tomorrow and hoped Minnie's next letter would contain news about their sisters. She drew the curtains apart, peering at the quiet streets below. The chilly air caressed her face, and her mind drifted to Jeff, then to Shelby. Her heart squeezed uncomfortably. Who would she choose? What a ridiculous thought. She chided herself. Shelby wasn't here, and Jeff hadn't expressed his wishes to court her. Or had he? She tilted her head. Hadn't he mentioned taking her to the rodeo last night? She tapped her chin, squinting her brows. Had he, or had he not? She soon gave up trying to recall. Perhaps Hannah was right. She'd been so blinded by thoughts of Shelby that she hadn't been able to see anything else. Not even the zealous sheriff, who always found time from his duties to check on them several times a week. She took a step away from the window, her mind cluttered with thoughts. She ran a hand through her hair, loosening it from the careless bun, before laying on the bed. Thoughts of both men danced around in her head until she gave up trying to sleep. Staying awake all night, pining over either of them would be unwise. Annie rose from the bed. Carrying the lamp, she left her room and tiptoed down the stairs to the empty parlor. The piano called to her. She touched the keys lightly, a small smile curving her lips. She hadn't expected to find a piano in the inn, until Frida had suddenly remembered an old dusty piano she'd kept locked away due to lack of use. She struck a note. The sound faded away, melting into the silence. The sheriff had seen her as she'd laid her soul bare, poured out her heart, and surrendered to the music. The odd look in his eyes still baffled her. What had he been thinking? "You play beautifully." Soft laughter bubbled out of her. Jeff's words had touched her more than he'd ever known. Those were the exact words her father used to say whenever he heard her play. He never tired of saying it, and he never tired of listening. Peter MacPherson had taught her all she knew. A sob welled in her throat, and the knot in her chest tightened. Oh, how she missed him. Sometimes home calls to us when we least expect it, and sometimes it's a call you can never heed. Jeff's words had reverberated in her mind for hours. The pain in his eyes had roused my questions, none of which she'd been bold enough to ask. And now, in the solitude of her thoughts, her curiosity stirred. Where was his home? And what past tortured him so? And why exactly did she care to know? Annie withdrew her hand from the piano. There I go again, thinking of him. Soft laughter floated to her ears. Laura and Edith, the late-night gigglers, as they were often called. The two had become best friends and were always the last to fall asleep. Only Frida slept early. She always insisted they go to bed earlier than the women were used to. Especially Annie, who'd indulged in many late-night conversations with her sisters. Annie opened the door quietly. She inhaled the calming air as the soft breeze blew tendrils of hair away from her face. She sat on the old wicker chair on the porch, watching a few townsfolk walking past. None of them noticed her sitting on the porch and looking on as the rest of the world passed by. The night sounds quietened her thoughts. Laying her head back, she shut her eyes. A sharp sound made her eyes snap open. She scanned the surroundings for the source of the sound. A shadowy figure caught her eye. The figure didn't walk past like others. Annie squinted, trying to make out the person. He stopped several feet from the inn, looking up at the window to her room. She leaned forwards, curious. The figure bent and threw a stone upwards. Annie froze. What was he doing? "Annie?" he whisper-yelled. She gasped. "Shelby?" He whirled around to face her. "Annie." He hurried towards her. Her heart beat fast, and she was suddenly breathless. He was here. He was finally here. What was he doing here? He stepped on the porch, holding his hands out. "I wanted to see you. I couldn't wait till morning." He was breathless, as though he'd been running for a long time. "Where is the necklace I gave you?" Annie touched her neck. "It wasn't there. It's upstairs. What are you doing here so late?" Name glanced around. "I need the necklace." He grabbed her arm. "Where is it?" Annie stared at him, confused by his reaction. We can talk about this tomorrow." "I need it now." His face loomed closer to hers, and she shrunk. His features were contorted in rage. He sneered. Coldness spread through her. Where was her charming, soft-spoken Shelby? This wasn't the Shelby she knew. This was someone else entirely. "Why are you so upset?" His hand tightened around her arm. She bit back a yelp of pain. "You're hurting me." The sound of footsteps caught her attention. "Where is he?" He cussed under his breath. "Come with me. I promised to come for you. Now it's time." "No." She struggled against him. "Let me go." The footsteps loomed closer. Shelby grabbed her and started dragging her away from the inn. He clamped a hand over her mouth, stifling her screams. Annie's heart thrummed painfully in her chest. She couldn't believe it. What was happening? Where was he taking her to? And why? Oh, why? Hadn't she forced herself to go to bed instead of coming out here alone? Chapter 9. Jeff was on his way home when he heard Burke yelling his name. "Jeff, something's wrong." Jeff stopped in his tracks. "What?" "There's pandemonium. I hear some men from the tavern are searching for the jewel thief. He stole one of the miners' gold." Jeff hurried after him. They rode towards the tavern, keeping their eyes peeled out for any sign of something unusual. They didn't stop running until they got to the tavern. A group of men was clustered in a corner, throwing words at each other. The ear-splitting noise made him cringe. Simon broke apart from the group after spotting Jeff and Burke. "What happened here?" Jeff asked. "You came right on time. So many valuables have been stolen." He pointed at a broken table. "There was a fight. I'm not certain what it's about, but I think someone accused Danny of cheating at a game. Next thing I know, Several people are complaining about missing valuables. What did he steal? Simon scratched his head. Some gold, a pouch of money, a ring for Danny's intended. Jeff had heard enough. He turned to the door, then paused. Was there a woman here? Did anyone try distracting the men? Simon blinked. Well, a soiled dove came in earlier. I can't recall her name. She's new in town, I think. Caused quite a ruckus. I hear she plays cards better than most men. He glanced around the room. Don't know where she went off to. Do you know where the thief went? Burke asked. Some men have gone after him. They went towards the inn. Jeff dashed out of the tavern, leaving the rowdiness behind. When he got to the inn, Frida was standing outside with Hannah holding a lamp. Worry danced in her eyes. What's going on? Jeff's gut tightened. Whatever it was, he wasn't going to like it. I came downstairs to get some water, heard some voices outside. When I heard some muffled screaming, I knew something was wrong, Hannah said, tears in her eyes. Then we discovered Annie was missing. Jeff's heart dropped to his stomach. Missing? How? The thief, Burke said, confirming his worst fear. He passed this way. Maybe he took her. Jeff glanced around, his mind scrambling to make sense of it all. Why would the jewel thief take Annie? It made no sense, unless... Cold poured down his spine. He grasped Hannah's shoulders. Who was the man she was waiting for? What's his name? Hannah stuttered. Shelby. Her eyes widened. Gasping, she turned to Frida. Do you think he's taken her? Jeff let her go. Her lips wobbled and she stumbled backward. Burke quickly reached out, so she fell into his arms instead. Jeff cussed under his breath. This was his fault. If he'd been more intentional in finding out about Shelby, Annie wouldn't be in such a position. Instead, he'd let his ego blind him. What do you know about Shelby? He asked Frida. Her face was a mask of sadness. Nothing. He's not from here. That's all I know. I never trusted him. I barely even saw him. Go in, lock the doors, and stay safe. I'll get her back. He turned to Burke. Keep them safe. Burke seemed as if he was about to protest. Instead, he nodded and led the women into the inn. Jeff waited until they were safely inside the inn before hurrying towards the surrounding forest. The trees were static shadows in the darkness. They stretched on for miles. Jeff squinted, searching for signs of any movement. A low murmur drew his attention to the group of men approaching from the west. We can't find him, one of the men said. We thought he went that way, but we saw no sign of him. I want my gold back, Sheriff. Jeff grunted. I'll find him. He won't see me coming. He'll assume we've given up on trailing him. Thinking of how to find Annie was utmost on his mind. Still, he had to keep everyone safe. No one else had to be in danger. Placing a hand on his pocket, he felt the bulge of his pistol. He forced himself to breathe against the weight of guilt crushing him. How could he have been so blind? Jealousy had clouded his thoughts, dimming his razor-sharp focus into thinking all he had to do was get Annie to become interested in him so she'd forget about Shelby. If anything happened to her. A muffled scream. Jeff stopped in his tracks. He strained his ears, scanning the scenery for any sign of Shelby. Jeff dropped to a crawl, keeping his steps as light as possible. Quiet, woman, Shelby said. Jeff felt a rush of déjà vu. Shelby stepped out of the shadows, a hand clasped on Annie's mouth. Light from the crescent moon reflected a part of the forest not covered by endless trees. You've ruined things for me here, Shelby, a woman said, following him. Now I can't go back to work. Quit your belly-aching, Sarah. You'll find a job somewhere else. Because of your carelessness, we'll have to walk to another town, and then you'll ruin it again with your stealing. I'm tired of living like this. Quiet! Jeff had had enough. Reaching for his gun, he stepped out of hiding. Heads turned to him. Let her go. The night went still. Jeff inched his gun at Shelby. Annie's face held fear. He glanced at Sarah. Her eyes were wide in her painted face. Shelby drew Annie closer to him. You've stolen, plundered, and conned men out of their valuables. Why are you taking her? She didn't return what was mine, Shelby spoke in clipped tones, and I already promised to take her with me anyway. We'll be wedded soon, and she can make up for what she refused to give back. Jeff's head rang. His jaw went slack, and he gawked at Shelby. He'd met several outlaws, and he never ceased to be amazed by the way some men thought. How could he think of kidnapping a bride? You can't force her to marry you. He raised the gun. Hand her over. Shelby had been caught unaware, and he didn't seem to have a gun. From the corner of his eye, he noticed Sarah slinking into the shadows. He paid her no mind. He'd come here for Annie and for the valuables Shelby had stolen. She loves me, Annie protested, her eyes widening. She shook her head. Shelby uttered a shout, snatching his hand away from her mouth. Annie darted away from him, but he quickly dragged her back. Jeff lunged forward, his hand tight on his pistol. He reached for Shelby, drawing him away from Annie, whose high-pitched scream almost blew his eardrums. A gunshot. Sleeping birds flapped their wings, hurrying away from the trees. Jeff turned slowly, his mouth dropping in surprise at Sarah, who held the pistol. His gaze drifted to Annie. Her lips were moving, but he couldn't hear her. Tears streamed down her face. She rushed to his side, clutching his clothes. "Jeff," she sobbed. Finally, he thought, before his vision clouded and the world went dark. Chapter 10. Annie watched the gentle rise and fall of Jeff's chest. She fastened her gaze on his face, waiting for him to wake up. She'd been waiting for days. He'd saved her. She'd let herself be swept off her feet by a stranger despite Frida's warnings. How could she have been so foolish, so utterly naive? She'd ignored all Jeff's attempts at bonding with her, her head in the clouds while she daydreamed of a handsome stranger. After it all, Jeff had been the one to rescue her. And now, a sob welled in her throat. She clung to his hand, forcing air into her lungs. The curtains swung slightly, carried by the morning breeze. A hint of dust tickled her nose. She glanced around the room, noticing several things for the first time. It was the plainest room she'd ever seen. It was even less furnished than her room at the inn, with a bed, a small trunk, and nothing else. The rest of Jeff's house was no different. Minimal furniture, an old stove, and a few canned foods. Annie shuddered at the thought of what he'd been feeding himself with. He ran around ensuring everyone else was safe, sometimes at the risk of getting hurt. He took care of others, yet completely forgot about himself. She swept some tendrils of hair from his forehead, which gleamed with sweat. "Who will take care of you?" Her gaze drifted to the bandage wrapped around his torso. Memories of that horrid night flooded her thoughts, and her vision blurred. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, a tear trailing down her cheek. "This is all my fault. If I'd listened to Frida, if I hadn't been so easily deceived, you wouldn't be hurt. Shelby," her blood boiled at the thought of him, "wouldn't have regarded me an easy target. He'd kidnapped her to marry her. It was all so ludicrous. The night had been filled with utter confusion. As he dragged her away from the inn, all she could think about was why. It had made no sense to her. Was he taking her away because she hadn't given him the necklace? Why couldn't he wait till morning? Who was he running from? When Sarah, his accomplice, had joined them, it had gradually become clear to her. Shelby was a thief. The necklace was one of the things he'd stolen from the townsfolks, and that was why he'd kept it with her. Irked that he hadn't been able to get it from her, and determined to make her his, he'd taken her away from the inn. To marry her, he'd said. Annie had never known affection could turn to dislike so quickly. He didn't love her at all. He'd only wanted to plunder and take from others without caring about anything but his greed. "I'd like a man who is kind, who does all he can to protect those he loves, and who cares deeply for me," she'd said on her first day in Huntsville. That man hadn't been Shelby. That man was the person she'd been too blind to see for weeks. Jeff's eyes fluttered slightly. She sat up, holding her breath and waiting for him to wake. He uttered a low groan, his face contorting slightly. "Jeff?" He didn't respond. A knock on the door drew her away from his bedside. Before leaving the room, she glanced back at him, hoping he'd finally wake up. He didn't. Annie left the room to let Burke in. His face was strained with worry. "Is he awake?" Annie shook her head. Burke muttered under his breath. She beckoned towards the parlor. "You must be tired." Burke had been holding the fort since Jeff sustained his injury. "Your friends extended their greetings," he said, lowering himself to a chair. "Especially Hannah. She's very worried about you. She offered to bring you a meal later today. She's very sweet." A smile curved his lips. His eyes gleamed, and Annie's mood lifted. Perhaps one good thing had come out of this unfortunate circumstance. Hannah might have found her groom. For a split second, she forgot her pain. "You are fond of her." It wasn't a question. Burke grinned. I wasn't keen on mail-order brides. Ne'er even thought I'd marry someone that isn't from around here. He lifted a shoulder in a shrug. But there's something about Hannah. I don't know. After all this is over, I'll ask to court her properly. Annie smiled. That would be wonderful. Burke glanced at the door to Jeff's room. The doctor will stop by this evening to check on him. Jeff, he exhaled audibly. It's easy to be mad at him. He always jumps into risky situations without a care for his life, always playing the hero, always wanting to do it all by himself. It's frustrating. Maybe he thinks no one would care if anything happened to him. His gaze found hers. He's wrong. What about his family? There was so much she didn't know about him. So much. Yet all she saw whenever she looked at him was a man desperate to prove himself. He has no family. Lost them all in a violent land grab almost 2 decades ago. It haunts him still. He was too young to do anything to help them. I don't know how he escaped. Perhaps the outlaws thought he was far too young to pose a threat. He traveled from one town to the other, never staying in a place for more than a few months or years. He's been in Huntsville for 3 years. I used to wonder when he'd disappear and move to another town. Then I realized he might never leave. He was finally doing what he hadn't been able to do for those he loved, protect. The room was silent. Annie mulled over his words, her heart filled with sympathy and grief for the little boy that had watched as everything had been taken from him. How had he survived alone? What risks had he taken? I ne'er saw the sheriff look happier than I have in the past week. He's been less of a workaholic lately. Burke shot her a knowing look. Then I heard he's been showing up at the inn quite often. Heat flooded Annie's cheeks. She stared at her clasped hands, tongue-tied. I didn't know he fancied me. Burke guffawed. You didn't know? Even a blind man could see it. Ne'er seen Jeff be so smitten by a woman, ever. He always turns down dinner invitations from mothers wanting him to wed their daughters. I thought he'd be a bachelor forever. Then you came along. He called me a thief, Annie said, laughing. I couldn't have thought he wished to court me. Her mirth died quickly. I hope he'll be all right. If Burke hadn't shown up just in time, Annie wasn't sure what would have happened. She'd been wailing on Jeff's chest, helpless and confused. Shelby yelled at his accomplice, then turned to grab her. Annie fought with all she had, which was very little compared to his brute strength. Then Burke had arrived with a group of men and saved the day. Shelby and Sarah were arrested. Jeff was attended to by the doctor, and she'd been by his side ever since. Burke stood. I came by to check on him. I'm afraid I forgot to purchase some things from the store. Canned beans alone wouldn't satisfy your hunger. After he left, the silence became deafening. She stood with her back against the door, her head whirling with thoughts. A low moan came from Jeff's room. She bolted into the room. Jeff was sitting up, holding his side. She gaped at him. Jeff, she rushed to his side. You're awake. How are you feeling? Jeff's gaze focused on her. What are you doing here? I stayed back to look after you. He shifted closer to her, wincing. You stayed? Disbelief coated his words. Why? You saved me? Jeff grimaced. Gratitude. He spoke in an odd tone. Annie bit her lip, weighing her words. She could stay quiet and let him think she'd only stayed because she felt indebted to him. And then what would happen? Annie sucked in a breath, keeping her attention on her shaking hands. Her words died in her throat. She glanced at him. Jeff sat back, his eyes closed, pain flashing on his features. I did my duty as the sheriff. I kept you safe. His words were curt. Then he opened his eyes, and the depth of emotions in them left her short of words, rendered her speechless. That's not the only reason. Her sudden bravery surprised her. Is it? Jeff gave her a long look. Even though everything in her wanted to look away from his intense gaze, she kept her eyes locked on his. You're right, that's not the only reason. Annie held her breath, waiting. I wanted to court you, Annie, despite your affection for someone else. He shut his eyes, sighing. I suppose love is as blinding as they say. Annie's heart skipped a beat. He loved her? Her tongue was glued to the roof of her mouth. She paused to think. Her affection for Shelby had died off in the wake of her discovery of who he truly was. But that wasn't all there was to it. Her feelings for him had waned before that night when she'd started to see Jeff more often. Right now, sitting beside him, the truth was clear to her. It's not too late. She spoke quietly, barely above a whisper. The past months have been difficult for me. After I lost my father, I felt as if the world had been dragged out from under me. Then my cousin, she cleared her throat. I ran away from him. He wanted to marry me off to a stranger. Alienated from my family, I felt lost. Coming to Huntsville to join the mail order convoy was the only option I had. After the uncertainty of the past few months, all I wanted was to feel safe. I thought I felt safe with Shelby. She released a breath. I was wrong. Understanding sparked in his eyes. He reached out and squeezed her hand. I suppose a tragic past is one thing we have in common. A tearful laugh escaped her throat. He reached a hand towards her, and she leaned against his uninjured side. His heartbeat was music to her ears. I do feel safe, she whispered, with you. He pressed a kiss to her hair. I vow to always keep you safe, Annie. Always. Annie shut her eyes, feeling his warmth against her. Burke is angry with me, isn't he? Annie giggled. Furious. Epilogue. I ne'er thought this day would come, Burke said, slapping Jeff on the back. You had us all counting down the years until you'd get a bride. I told Simon Eyre that it'd happen, but he didn't believe me. I almost gave up myself. Jeff's laughter joined the others. To Jeff, Burke said, raising a mug, the best Sheriff Huntsville could ever ask for. To Jeff, the men chorused. The hearty laughter of the men filled the tavern. Simon eagerly passed out drinks. On the house, he yelled at intervals. Don't go into debt on my account, Jeff said, raising a mug to his lips. The liquid burned his throat. He grimaced. It had been years since he'd tasted alcohol. He'd almost been as bad as Primus, drinking away his sadness and hard-earned money. But there was no risk of that happening again. He wasn't a hopeless man wandering the West in search of a home. He'd found his home and a reason to stay. He looked up to see the men staring at him. What? Burke punched a fist into the air. You owe me $10, Simon. Jeff glanced between the two men, utterly confused. A few seconds later, it dawned on him. They'd made a bet on whether or not he'd drink. Jeff threw his head back and laughed. Today's not your day, he said, shaking his head. Simon was unfazed. But it's your day. He winked, heading to the bar to get more drinks. Say, how does it feel to be a husband? Burke asked, grinning. Jeff pushed the chair back and stood. You'd find out for yourself once you stop waiting so long and ask Hannah for her hand. He started heading out of the tavern. The men called after him, asking him to stay for an hour more. Jeff shook his head. No can do, men. I have a wife to get home to. Jeff left the noise behind and stepped into the relatively quiet night. Humming a tune, he hurried toward home. The closer he got, the lighter his steps. Life was a wonderful dream. He'd woken up this morning and had barely resisted the urge to pinch himself when he saw Annie's beautiful face so close to his. He had a wife, a family, a home. His house looked new. It wasn't dark and desolate like it used to be, but bright and welcoming. He opened the door. The golden glow of the lamp lit up the room. A delicious aroma wafted into his nostrils, and his mouth watered. Jeff scanned the parlor for Annie. She wasn't there. Annie, he called, entering their room. She stood with her back to him, clutching a letter in her hands. She rushed into his arms. Oh, Jeff, tears brimmed in her eyes. Something's happened back home.